The air in the bottega was thick with the scent of turpentine, sweat, and ground lapis lazuli, a heavy, sweet perfume of artistic ambition and desperate labor. Leo Rinaldi, barely 20 years old, felt the familiar ache in his shoulder, a dull throb earned from hours spent stretching linen canvas, pounding pigments, and, more recently, from the relentless, precise movement of his own brush. He was perched precariously on a scaffold, his face a smudge of earth tones, his eyes, the sharp, piercing gray of a Florentine winter sky, fixed on the vast, unforgiving expanse of the frescoed wall. He was applying a final wash of azzurro oltremare, ultramarine, to the Virgin's robe in the lower corner of the great mural. It was the color of the sea at its deepest, most luminous, and it was ruinously expensive, its cost exceeding gold, its value a measure of the master's trust. Every apprentice in Florence knew that handling ultramarine was an honor and a profound risk. Spill it, waste it, and the debt could bind a family for a generation. A sharp, grating cough echoed from the shadowed corner of the studio, making the scaffold tremble slightly. "Mind the line, boy." The voice belonged to Master Cosimo Bellini, a man whose reputation was as monumental as the dome of the Duomo that loomed outside their window. Bellini was Florence's artistic darling, the preferred painter of the powerful Medici family, the man who gave life to marble and gold. He was also a demanding tyrant, with a temper as volatile as the furnace used to forge gilding. "The folds must be light, Leo," Bellini continued, his voice closer now, the sound of his heavy, embroidered velvet slippers a soft, rhythmic padding on the stone floor. "It is the Virgin. Her garment is not a sack of grain. It must float. Show me the soul of the cloth, not merely its dye." Leo gritted his teeth, the words stinging like acid. He adjusted the angle of his hand, his heart beginning the familiar, stressful gallop. He knew anatomy, perspective, and composition. Master Bellini himself had conceded that Leo's grasp of light was almost unnerving. Yet Bellini always found the flaw, the subtle failing, the reminder that Leo was not the creator, only the hand. He dipped his brush again, the sapphire pigment gleaming on the sable tip. His focus narrowed, the roar of the city outside, the clang of the blacksmith, the calls of the street vendors, the chatter of passing contessa, fading away. He didn't just paint the fold, he felt the weight and texture of the velvet he imagined, guided by the very geometry of light and shadow. He placed the brush down, a breath-held stroke of perfection, the blue instantly dissolving the flatness of the wall, giving the cloth a living volume. A silence stretched, taut and unbearable, broken only by the scratching of a charcoal stick on a prepared panel nearby. Bellini didn't move. He stood below, a formidable silhouette against the sun-drenched window, his hands clasped behind his back, his brow furrowed in a permanent scowl of genius. "Good," he finally conceded, the word dragged out like a confession. "For an apprentice. Now descend. The hour is late, and I have need of a fresh palette. And do not track any dust on the finished section of the pavement. I swear, Rinaldi, you track more earth than a team of oxen." Leo swallowed his pride, carefully tucking his brush into his belt. He was so close to finishing this section, so close to being able to move to the main figures, the part where his creativity could actually take flight. He descended the scaffold, his legs cramped but steady. As he stepped onto the stone floor, his gaze snagged on a new, unsettling sight. Near Bellini's easel sat another young man. He was tall, dressed in a fashionable doublet of mulberry silk, his dark hair carefully styled, and he was not scrubbing pots or grinding paints. He was sketching a complex, nude anatomical study, a task strictly forbidden to any apprentice until years of mastery were achieved. This was Giuliano Morelli, Bellini's new favorite. He had arrived only 3 months prior, not as a ragged orphan like Leo, but as a protege of a wealthy banking family. He had the arrogant ease of a man who knew he could not fail. He had the master's ear, a private corner of the studio, and more gallingly, he was already being given major preparatory commissions. Giuliano looked up from his work, his lips curving into a slow, superior smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. His gaze landed not on Leo, but on the tiny, almost invisible speck of ultramarine dust clinging to Leo's leather apron. "Careful, Rinaldi." Giuliano's voice was smooth, a polished stone. "That dust on your garment is worth more than the whole of your family's land, should you even possess any." Leo ignored the jab at his humble origins, instead walking directly to the master's work table. He began the meticulous work of setting the palette, mixing the pigments with oil, egg yolk, and water, a chemical alchemy he knew by touch. "Master," Leo asked, keeping his tone carefully neutral, "is the composition for the new Marriage of the Virgin on schedule? I can begin the preparatory washes for the perspective next week, if you approve." Bellini didn't answer immediately. He picked up a sheet of parchment and unfurled it. It was a perfect, intricate charcoal drawing of the Virgin's face, the shading exquisite, the expression one of fragile yet determined humility. "The preliminary sketch is complete, but not by you, Leo. Giuliano executed this. His use of sfumato on the veil is modern." Leo stared at the drawing. It was perfect, technically brilliant, but it lacked the spark, the raw emotional power that Leo himself strove for. He felt a sudden cold dread coil in his gut. The Marriage of the Virgin was the major commission of the year, a centerpiece for a powerful, noble family. The lead hand on that project would be seen as the master's true successor. "The master has already given me the honor of the final drawing," Giuliano chimed in, rising from his chair, stretching with affected grace. "I must confess, I find these biblical pieces rather restrictive. I'm eager to apply my skills to portraiture. The more challenging, the better." He met Leo's eyes, and this time the challenge was clear. The air in the bottega was no longer just turpentine and pigment. It was rivalry, sharp and intoxicating. The focus of that rivalry was not just fame. It was centered on the single most beautiful and most enigmatic person in all of Florence, Contessa Isabella de' Rossi. She was not a patron, but she was the unofficial muse and intellectual heart of the city's artistic circle. She hosted the salons, judged the new works, and more importantly, she was the subject of the portrait Bellini had just been commissioned to paint for the new Duke of Milan. It was the most coveted commission in Italy, and the prize wasn't just gold, it was access to the mind and heart of the Renaissance itself. Bellini smoothed the parchment of Giuliano's drawing. "The Duke will arrive in 3 days to see the initial sketches for the Contessa's portrait. He demands excellence. He demands a vision." He looked from Giuliano, polished and confident, to Leo, intense and dirt-smudged. "I want both of you to prepare a detailed sketch of the Contessa's hands. Her hands are legendary. They hold the wisdom of a scholar and the grace of a dancer. The one who captures their spirit will assist me in the final painting."
Leo's head snapped up. This was it, a chance to compete, openly, for the true prize. A chance to step out of the apprentice's shadow. But Giuliano, ever the step ahead, merely smiled, a predatory gleam in his eye. "Master, I have already secured a private sitting with the Contessa. I believe I have the advantage of a closer inspection." Leo's heart sank. Giuliano had used his family connections. The deck was already stacked. Capture the spirito of the hands. He needed more than a drawing. He needed a story. He needed a revelation. As Leo left the suffocating air of the bottega, and stepped out into the bustling, noisy glory of Florence. The setting sun was turning the Arno River to liquid fire. He knew, instinctively, that this competition was about more than a portrait. It was about destiny, and he would not lose. He knew where Isabella de Rossi spent her late afternoons, in the secluded ancient gardens of the Palazzo Rossi, reading or discussing philosophy with the city's most brilliant minds. It was a sacred, private space, and entering it without invitation was a crime. But Bellini hadn't asked for permission. He had asked for a spirito, and sometimes, to capture the light, you had to risk the darkness. Leo turned his footsteps toward the imposing, high stone walls of the Palazzo Rossi, the weight of his charcoal stick suddenly feeling like a weapon, or perhaps a key. The game had begun. The city of Florence, even at twilight, was a sensory riot. The clatter of metalworking in the Oltranorno district, the rich aroma of baking bread and roasting meats mingling with the stench of the river, and the constant, echoing clamor of human ambition. But as Leo Rinaldi approached the Palazzo Rossi, a silence descended, the heavy, opulent quiet of true power. The Palazzo Rossi stood apart, a fortress of chiseled sandstone, guarded by high walls woven with flowering jasmine and ivy. To breach those walls, even just to glimpse a hand, was an act of trespass. Leo circled the perimeter, his sharp eyes scanning for weakness. The main gate was iron, formidable, and likely guarded. The adjacent buildings were too high to jump from. But then he saw it. An old, massive fig tree, its trunk thicker than a cartwheel, growing flush against the far corner of the wall. Its branches, old and gnarled, reached well over the coping stones. He waited for the last light of day to fade, cloaking himself in the deep violet shadows. He needed not just silence, but invisibility. He was a ragazzo of the streets, and while the Master Bellini had pulled him up, he hadn't entirely scrubbed the street cunning out of him. With the agility born of years spent scaling scaffolds, Leo shimmied up the rough bark of the fig tree. The leaves, broad and sticky, provided perfect cover. He reached the coping, his fingers scraping on the rough stone, and peered down. The Rossi Gardens were a masterpiece of Renaissance planning. Geometrically perfect box hedges, marble statuary depicting stoic Roman gods, and a central fountain that whispered rather than roared. And there, near the fountain, bathed in the soft flickering light of oil lamps, sat Contessa Isabella de Rossi. She was leaning slightly forward, her posture perfect, engaged in discussion. Around her sat three men, a renowned philosopher, an elderly scholar of Greek texts, and a poet whose verses were currently the sensation of the city. Isabella wasn't a passive listener. She was the axis around which the conversation turned. Leo focused on her hands. They were in constant motion, illustrating her points. Sometimes they rose, open and expressive, pleading a philosophical point. Other times they rested lightly on her knee, the fingers long, slender, yet with a surprising strength in their shape, the kind of hands that held a quill firmly, not just elegantly. He could see the slight blue tracery of veins beneath the pale, translucent skin, the sharp definition of the knuckles, the almost architectural shape of the wrist. Giuliano Morelli might have secured a formal sitting, a pose carefully choreographed for flattery, but in these spontaneous and animated gestures, Leo saw the soul the master had spoken of. He saw the intellectual fire, the wit, the humanity. He pulled a piece of charcoal and a small wax-coated parchment from his belt pouch. He couldn't be too detailed, the light was poor, and he had to be fast. He used quick, dynamic lines, not bothering with shading, capturing the movement, the way the index finger tapped against the thumb in emphasis, the way the wrist arched when she dismissed a point. He was drawing the invisible force of her personality, channeled through her physical form. A sudden, sharp movement below froze his hand. The conversation had ended. The scholars were rising, bowing to the Contessa. Isabella stood, and as she did, she turned her head, looking directly toward the high wall, toward the fig tree. Leo flattened himself against the stone, holding his breath, his heart slamming against his ribs like a trapped bird. Had she seen him? Impossible. The light was too poor, his position too well hidden. But she didn't move away. She stood, gazing. Her eyes, large, dark, and utterly composed, seemed to pierce the shadows. Leo felt a bizarre sensation, as if she wasn't looking at the wall, but through it, sensing his presence, his intense scrutiny. After a moment that stretched into an agonizing eternity, Isabella lifted her hand again. She didn't wave or gesture. Instead, she brought her fingers together, forming a perfect, elegant circle. A gesture often used in painting to check perspective or frame a face. It was as if she was acknowledging the unseen viewer, posing for the ghost in the tree. Then she turned and walked, her silk gown whispering against the marble path, disappearing into the depths of the palazzo. Leo slowly let out the breath he'd been holding. His chest ached. It wasn't just her beauty, which was undeniable. It was her awareness. She was a subject who understood the act of being observed, who perhaps even embraced the gaze of the artist. He risked a glance at his parchment. The quick sketches were raw, vital, alive. They captured not the stillness of a posed statue, but the active intelligence of a Renaissance woman. He had what he came for. Carefully, silently, he descended the tree, his heart still thrumming with adrenaline and a strange, exhilarating sense of being seen. He melted back into the shadows of the Florentine streets. The next morning, in Bellini's bottega, was a study in contrasts. Giuliano Morelli presented his drawing with the flourish of a magician revealing a trick. It was exquisite, a life-size rendering of the Contessa's hands, posed delicately on a velvet cushion. Every knuckle, every fingernail, every crease was rendered with perfect chiaroscuro. It was technically masterful, a study in idealized elegance. "I had her rest her hands, master," Giuliano explained, his voice smooth with self-satisfaction. "It allowed me to focus on the structure and the texture of the skin. Note the subtle use of white chalk on the highlights. It suggests the pearl-like sheen of her youth." Bellini squinted at the drawing, adjusting his spectacles. Technically impeccable, Giuliano. The Duke will appreciate the fidelity. It is a hand ready for a gold ring." Giuliano beamed, shooting a triumphant glance at Leo. Then Leo stepped forward. He placed his rough, small parchment on the table next to Giuliano's monument of detail. His sketches were a jumble of lines, a sequence of moments, the hand raised in philosophical debate, the index finger tapping a rhythm of impatience, the wrist arched in dismissal, and finally the two fingers forming the perfect self-aware circle. Silence fell in the bottega. Bellini didn't touch the parchment. He leaned in, his silver beard brushing the wood, his eyes moving rapidly over the chaotic lines. "What is this, Rinaldi?" the master asked, his voice low, almost dangerous. "It is a scribble. It lacks finish. It lacks respect for the subject's dignity. It looks as if you stole these movements in the dark." "I did, master," Leo said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. I observed the Contessa in discussion, in the moments when she was not thinking of the painter, but of the philosophy. Giuliano has drawn a beautiful glove, master. I have tried to draw the mind that moves it. Giuliano scoffed, a small, arrogant sound. The mind? This is insolence, Rinaldi. You lack the discipline to render detail. You have presented a series of crude gestures. Bellini ignored Giuliano. He looked up at Leo, his ancient eyes piercing. Show me the gesture of dismissal. Leo pointed to the arched wrist sketch. She had just been told that women were incapable of understanding true political governance, master. The hand is not merely dismissing the man, it is dismissing the entire concept of his argument. It has the weight of centuries of suppressed intellect suddenly given voice. Bellini stared at the drawing, then at Leo, a flicker of something raw and appreciative in his eyes. He picked up Giuliano's flawless drawing, then Leo's rough sketches. He placed them side by side. Giuliano, Bellini said, a finality in his tone. Your work is the foundation. It shows skill, fidelity, and mastery of form. The Duke will be pleased. Giuliano's chest swelled. But Rinaldi, Bellini continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. Yours is the insight. This scribble has captured the breath of life. It contains a truth about the Contessa that no formal sitting could reveal. He pushed Giuliano's drawing to the side. He tapped Leo's final sketch, the circle. And this is the eye of the subject looking back at the artist. It is dangerous. Bellini looked up, and for the first time Leo saw the master's own ambition shining through. An ambition to be remembered not just as a painter, but as a chronicler of the Renaissance soul. The Duke will see both sketches, but only one will guide my brush. Rinaldi, you will prepare the canvas. The geometry, the perspective, the initial washes, it is yours. Giuliano, you will prepare the primary pigments and the gold leaf. You are both essential. It was not a victory, but it was not a loss. It was an acknowledgement. Leo had earned his spot on the prestigious portrait commission, side by side with his rival. However, Bellini added, leveling his gaze at Leo, the Duke is a connoisseur of patience. The Contessa must be presented in the style he expects. If your insight ever overrides my final vision, Rinaldi, you will be back to scrubbing latrines. Understand? Understood, master, Leo replied, a profound sense of purpose filling him. He was on the canvas. He was in the game. As Leo began the exhilarating task of preparing the enormous panel, checking the wood for knots, smoothing the surface with pumice, and applying the first thin layers of gesso, he noticed Giuliano watching him. There was no longer arrogance in Giuliano's eyes, but a simmering, dangerous hatred. You got lucky, street dog, Giuliano muttered, walking past Leo, his silk doublet rustling. But the Duke is due on Friday, and I have one more advantage you do not. I know the colors the Contessa wears, the exact shade of her favorite gown. It is a costly, rare dye. Without it, your perspective will be an empty stage. Leo stopped sanding. Color was everything in Florence. A misplaced shade could ruin a painting, or worse, insult a patron. What color? Leo asked. Giuliano paused at the door, his hand on the latch. He turned back, a cruel smile spreading across his face. Rosso Veneziano, the Venetian red. Only the merchants of the Rialto carry the correct hue, and the master will need it by Thursday. I suggest you pray to your saints for a very fast horse. Leo knew it was a near impossible task. Venice was days away. Getting the specific pigment by Thursday meant riding non-stop, breaking every law of travel and navigating the treacherous and bandit-ridden passes between Tuscany and the Veneto.
Giuliano had set a deadline designed for failure. But Leo didn't need to ride all the way to Venice. He just needed to find a merchant who had recently made the journey. And in Florence, if you wanted anything, you didn't go to the palace. You went to the market. Leo left the prepared panel, the rough gesso drying under the Tuscan sun. He tossed his apron aside. It was time to leave the studio and re-enter the chaotic world of the streets. The painter of Florence was about to become a desperate courier.
Leo plunged into the dizzying chaos of the Mercato Nuovo, the heart of Florentine commerce, where gold, silk, and every luxury imaginable changed hands. It was here, not in the marble halls of the Palazzo, that the true power of the Renaissance, wealth, resided. His quest was for a single critical color, rosso veneziano, Venetian red, the costly pigment derived from the Kermes insect or a specific type of earth, prized for its deep, vibrant, and stable crimson hue. Giuliano's taunt that the pigment was only in Venice was designed to send Leo on a fruitless journey. Leo knew the merchant networks well enough to know that nothing that valuable traveled without intermediaries. He bypassed the high-end silk and jewelry stalls, heading straight for the cluster of booths managed by the spice and dye merchants, the men who held the keys to color and flavor. He approached a weathered, sharp-eyed man named Umberto, known for his vast, if sometimes illicit, stock. "Umberto," Leo greeted, keeping his voice low and urgent, slipping a small silver quattrino into the merchant's palm. "I seek the true Venetian red, not the common terra rossa, but the shade fit for a contessa, the shade of the Rialto." Umberto weighed the coin, his eyes darting quickly around the busy market. "Ah, the shade of the Medici. It is a dangerous color to transport, young Rinaldi. The taxes alone could buy you a small farm. It is for Master Bellini, for the portrait of Contessa de Rossi, commissioned by the Duke of Milan. The Duke is impatient. I need a quantity by tomorrow night. What is your price? And more importantly, your source?" Umberto scratched his grizzled chin. "I received a small quantity 3 days past, brought by a certain mule train from Ferrara, routed to avoid the Roman road tolls. It is flawless, packed in oil-sealed vellum. But my stock is spoken for by the Altoviti family for a great tapestry." Leo's heart sank. The Altoviti were a rival banking family to the Medici. Dealing with them was a political risk. "Umberto, the need is critical. I can double the Altoviti's current offer. I have Bellini's promise to settle the full cost." Umberto chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Bellini's promise doesn't buy me a mule, Leo. The Altoviti have already paid half in advance. Furthermore, they are very specific. They demand the pigment be delivered by noon tomorrow to their embroidery studio. Fail to deliver, and my neck is on the line, Leo. They will not take a promise over a guarantee." Leo knew this was the moment to gamble. He had no gold of his own, and Bellini, notoriously tight-fisted, was hours away. He had only his skill. "I cannot double their gold today," Leo admitted, looking the merchant straight in the eye. "But I can offer you a guarantee of a different kind. If you release the pigment to me now, I will not only ensure you are paid double by Bellini, but I will paint a portrait of your wife that will immortalize her. A profile in the style of the ancient Romans, finished within the week. Bellini's touch through my hand. No merchant in the city has a true Bellini portrait of his wife." Umberto's eyes widened, then narrowed. His wife, the portly but beloved Signora Sofia, had been complaining for years about the Contessa and Donna getting all the artistic glory.
A portrait by a Bellini apprentice, a promise of social mobility, was a currency often more valuable than gold in status-obsessed Florence. Umberto, you say, a lasting legacy, not just a fleeting profit? He hesitated, chewing on his lip. Show me your hands, boy. Let me see the hand that will immortalize my Sophia. Leo held out his hands, strong, capable, stained with every color under the sun. Umberto looked at the hands, then at Leo's intense, focused gray eyes. He saw the talent, the desperation, and the sheer audacity of the promise. You have 1 hour to deliver the pigment to Bellini's bottega, Umberto decided, slapping the counter. If Bellini does not send a sworn messenger with a contract and half the promised price by sunset, I send my own men to your studio to collect my pigment and your painting hand, Rinaldi, to ensure I receive some compensation. Leo didn't waste a moment thanking him. He accepted the small, oil-sealed vial of crimson. It felt cool and heavy in his palm, and ran. He arrived back at the studio, breathless and triumphant. He found Bellini not at the great easel, but in his small, cluttered office, hunched over ledgers and parchment. Master, I have secured the Venetian red, he announced, holding out the vial. The true shade, brought from Ferrara, but we have a small issue. Bellini didn't look up immediately. An issue? The pigment should be flawless. Giuliano assured me he'd secured the source. Giuliano only knew the name of the color master, Leo corrected, placing the vial on the desk. It was reserved by the Altoviti family. I secured it from Umberto, the merchant. He requires a promissory note and half the sum by sunset, and he's charging double the standard price, plus a personal commission for a portrait. Bellini stared at the magnificent crimson powder, then at Leo. The master's reputation was staked on meeting the Duke's deadline. The color was critical. He let out a long, weary sigh. You are as much a merchant as an artist, Rinaldi. Very well. Write the promissory note. I will sign it, and you will begin this ridiculous portrait of the merchant's wife after the Duke's viewing, not before. But if the Altoviti cause me any trouble over this, your debt is mine, and you will pay in service for the rest of your life, Rinaldi. Leo quickly penned the note, his hand shaking slightly with relief and the weight of the new responsibility. He had not only secured the color, but had gained a measure of independence, a commission, however ridiculous, signed under his own burgeoning name. He mixed the Venetian red, its glorious hue instantly enriching the palette. The pigment was ready, the canvas was ready. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Giuliano walked into the bottega, his mask of feigned innocence. The light is fading, Rinaldi. Did you enjoy your ride to Venice? Such a long journey for a boy who is so bad with distances. He sneered, walking past the palette. He stopped short, his eyes fixed on the vibrant smear of fresh crimson. His smile vanished, replaced by an expression of pure malice. Impossible. It's the genuine article, Giuliano, Leo said, carefully mixing an oil binder into the powder. And it's ready for the master tomorrow. I found a way to bridge the distance, even if you could not. Giuliano stepped closer, his voice dropping. You break the rules of this bottega, Rinaldi. You lack the pedigree, the refinement. The Contessa will not be impressed by your street cleverness. She admires the classical virtues, the flawless line, the kind of art that only I can provide. Leo didn't look up, focusing on his work. The Contessa admires truth, Giuliano, and the truth is, tomorrow I will be the one laying down the first essential color of her portrait. The stage was set. Tomorrow the Duke would arrive. The rivalry would move from a petty squabble over pigment to a life-changing confrontation over fame, fortune, and the favor of the extraordinary, Isabella de Rossi.
The next morning, the Medici Palace, Bellini's primary workspace, buzzed with a nervous, electric energy. The viewing was not just for the Duke of Milan, but for the entire Florentine art establishment, all eager to gauge Bellini's standing and, more crucially, the future of the Renaissance's artistic direction. Leo Rinaldi, focused and intensely practical, spent the early hours preparing the large wooden panel. The gesso, a white mixture of plaster, chalk, and glue, was perfectly smoothed and polished, providing a canvas of luminous white. He meticulously transferred the architectural lines of his perspective drawing, the vanishing points, the floor tiles, and the depth of the imagined room onto the panel, using a charcoal stylus, a grid system, and a straight edge. This painstaking work, the foundation of the painting, was what separated genius from a hopeful amateur. Giuliano Morelli, meanwhile, was holding court near the entrance, dressed in a magnificent new doublet of emerald velvet, regaling the master's junior assistants with fabricated tales of his private sitting with the Contessa. He repeatedly cast dismissive glances at Leo, who was down on his knees, breathing plaster dust and quietly building the invisible geometry of the masterpiece. At the center of the vast studio stood Master Bellini, his usual air of wearied genius replaced by a tense, professional alertness. He paced, checking the light, ensuring the velvet drape covering the canvas was flawlessly arranged. A fanfare of trumpets from the street announced the arrival. Duke Galeazzo Sforza of Milan entered the studio, not with the swagger of a soldier, but with the cool, calculating presence of a banker and strategist. He was a man of medium height, impeccably dressed in black Lombardy silk, with a heavy gold chain that spoke of ancient lineage and modern wealth. He was accompanied by his personal advisor, a thin, sharp-featured man named Niccolo Valerius, whose eyes seemed to miss nothing. After exchanging formal pleasantries with Bellini, the Duke cut straight to the business. "Master Bellini," the Duke's voice was smooth, a low baritone that commanded attention. "My interest in the Contessa is not merely sentimental. Her portrait must convey the intellectual prestige of Florence, a prestige I intend to harness through our new alliance. Show me the vision." Bellini directed his apprentices to pull the heavy drape. The pristine, prepared panel was revealed. The Duke stood before it, his hands clasped behind his back, examining the geometry. Leo's work was immediately evident. The perfect illusion of depth, the vanishing point precisely centered, guiding the eye into the imagined space. It was not yet a painting, but a promise of a space where the Contessa would live. "The perspective is flawless, Bellini," the Duke observed, nodding approvingly at the foundation. "But a portrait is not a landscape. Where is the soul?" Bellini gestured to his nearby table, where Giuliano had carefully arranged the initial studies. Giuliano stepped forward with his usual slick confidence, presenting his detailed, posed drawing of the Contessa's hands. "Your Grace, my study focuses on the classical ideal, the hand of a noblewoman, refined, ready to receive a marriage bond. I have captured the pure structure." The Duke picked up Giuliano's drawing. He admired the technique, the light, and the shadow. "It is elegant, Signor Morelli. A beautiful lie, perhaps, but beautiful nonetheless." Then Bellini picked up Leola's messy, vital sketches, the quick lines capturing movement, emotion, and intellect. He placed them directly next to Giuliano's polished work. "And this, Your Grace, is the alternative. It is the mind of the Contessa, not merely her adornments. The movement captured here," he pointed to the drawing of the hand held in philosophical argument, "shows her as the intellectual force that truly governs Florentine society." The Duke, ignoring the formal titles, looked at Leo's sketches, his expression unreadable. He seemed to sense the rough, unauthorized nature of the drawings. "Which hand will you paint, Master Bellini?" the Duke asked, looking at Bellini, but his cold eyes drifted towards Leo. "I will paint the truth, Your Grace. I will use Signor Morelli's technique for the fidelity of the form, but Signor Rinaldi's insight for the pose and the spirit. The Contessa will be seated, not passive, but poised, a figure of action, mid-thought. She will wear the Venetian red, the color of power and intellect, seated in the perfect perspective you now see. The Duke finally looked at Leo. He didn't see an apprentice, he saw the source of the radical, truthful sketches. You, young Rinaldi, you captured this insight? I observed the Contessa in her element, Your Grace. She is not a woman to be merely painted. She is a subject who demands to be understood. The Duke's advisor, Niccolo Valerius, leaned forward, a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head warning the Duke against the upstart. The Duke ignored his advisor. He walked towards Leo's workbench and picked up the small sealed vial of Rosso Veneziano. The color of power, the Duke murmured, turning the vial in his hand, admiring the deep crimson powder. An expensive choice, Bellini. But Milan is prepared for expense. Show me the color on the canvas. I wish to see the first strokes of my Contessa. This was the moment. The first application of the Venetian red. It was both a technical test and a symbolic inauguration. Giuliano stepped forward instantly. Master, I have the pigment perfectly mixed, ready for the initial wash. Bellini shook his head. No, the first stroke belongs to the man who captured the spirit. Rinaldi, you earned the color. You apply it. Show His Grace the beginning of my vision.
Giuliano's face went white with fury, but he dared not interrupt Bellini. Leo took the finest sable brush and with a steady hand dipped it into the newly mixed lustrous Venetian red. He approached the pristine white gesso of the panel, his heart a hammer in his chest. He didn't begin with the entire gown. Instead, guided by his sketches, he used the brush to lay down the first strokes for the edge of the Contessa's flowing velvet sash, a small but central piece of drapery that would hang over her knee. The color exploded against the white. It was rich, deep, and luminous, the perfect hue of intellectual ambition. Leo painted with a precision that bordered on defiance, establishing the volume of the fabric with a single, unbroken curve. The studio was silent. All eyes were on the crimson mark on the white panel. The Duke watched the stroke dry, then nodded slowly. This color is excellent, Rinaldi. You have a steady hand, but the true test is the face. Does this insight extend to her gaze? Leo's mind raced. He had not sketched the Contessa's face. Bellini was famous for his faces, his ability to capture melancholy and wisdom. The Duke was testing their entire operation. Suddenly, the studio doors opened and all eyes turned. Contessa Isabella de' Rossi herself stood in the doorway. She was magnificent, wearing a gown of the exact deep Venetian red, her dark hair pinned with pearls, her expression composed, regal, and intensely intelligent. She had come to pay her respects and to see her future painted self. She walked directly to the canvas, ignoring the Duke and the master for a moment, and stopped right beside Leo. She looked at the small, perfect crimson stroke on the panel. Then she looked up at Leo. Her eyes, those sharp, knowing eyes Leo had seen in the twilight, met his. She didn't smile, but a subtle, almost imperceptible warmth touched her lips. "The color suits me, Signor Rinaldi," she said, her voice clear and musical, addressing him directly, a shocking break of protocol. "It is the color of risk. You are indeed bold to use it for the first mark." The Duke watched this exchange, a sharp curiosity replacing his cold calculation. He had come for a painting. He was witnessing a complex, unspoken dynamic between the artist and his muse. "Contessa," the Duke finally interjected, his voice regaining its authority. "Master Bellini assures me that his new vision will capture the true force of your mind. I am intrigued. I shall return on the Ides of March,
in precisely 3 weeks to see the final finished work. If it matches the spirit of the sketches, Bellini, the gold is yours, and Rinaldi, you will be well rewarded. If it fails, I take my commission to Rome. Do not disappoint me." With a curt nod to Isabella and a chilling final glance at Leo, the Duke and his retinue swept out. The deadline was set. 3 weeks. It was an impossibly short time for a work of this size and detail. Bellini had secured the commission, but he was now under a crushing deadline. Master Bellini turned to Leo, his expression dark with immense pressure. 3 weeks, Rinaldi. The Duke has given me a task that demands a miracle. You have given me a vision, and now you have the Contessa's attention. You will not leave this studio. You will eat, sleep, and breathe this painting. You will paint the face, Rinaldi. I need your intensity, your boldness. The Duke wants a miracle, and you are the only one capable of delivering it." The master's words were a heavy weight, a terrifying honor. Leo would paint the most important face in Florence. But Bellini's trust was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the smallest failure, or by the constant, silent menace of Giuliano, who now stood in the corner, his eyes burning with a rivalry that had just turned lethal. The 3 weeks granted by the Duke of Milan became a frantic, enclosed world for Leo Rinaldi. The bottega transformed into a crucible of creative pressure, focused entirely on the massive portrait of Isabella de Rossi. Master Bellini, though supervising every major compositional decision, relied increasingly on Leo for the detailed, demanding work. The master painted the background architecture, the receding marble column, the view of a fictionalized Florentine street with his usual masterful precision. But the figure of Isabella, her form, her drapery, and most critically, her face, fell almost entirely to Leo. Bellini had a reason for this. His own health was failing, marked by an incessant cough and hands that trembled slightly with fatigue. He recognized that Leo possessed a youthful energy, and more importantly, a radical truthfulness in his observation that he himself, bound by tradition, could no longer access. Leo and Isabella began a relationship unique to the Renaissance, the painter and the muse. The Contessa came to the studio every afternoon. She did not merely sit, she posed, not for stillness, but for the capturing of a living moment. She wore the Venetian red gown, the color Leo had risked so much to secure, and sat not on a throne, but on a simple, elegant Savonarola chair, placed precisely at the vanishing point of Leo's perspective. In the first week, the work was a silence broken only by the scratching of brushes and the rustle of her silk gown. Leo focused on the body and the drapery. He laid down the deep, rich underpainting for the gown, using thin layers of oil paint, the sinopia and terra verde, to establish light and shadow before applying the costly Venetian red. "You look at the folds of my dress as if they are mountains, Signor Rinaldi," she commented one day, interrupting the silence. Leo kept his eyes on the canvas, his hand steady. "They are, Contessa, mountains of silk. Every valley of shadow, every peak of light must be accounted for. The fabric must not merely cover you, it must reveal the form beneath." "And what form is that?" she asked, a challenge in her tone. Leo finally lifted his gaze to her, meeting her dark eyes. "The form of intellect, Contessa. Your posture is not relaxed, it is tense with thought. The folds of your gown reflect the lines of your mind." He immediately returned to his work, lest the intensity of the look be mistaken for insolence. Yet a change had occurred. He had given her an honest answer, one that spoke to her mind, not just her beauty. From then on, their sittings became a series of whispered, intellectual discussions. While Leo painted, the Contessa spoke of the ancient Greeks, of Plato's forms, and the ideal geometry of beauty. Leo, in turn, spoke of Alberti's della pittura, explaining the new scientific theories of perspective, the geometry of the eye, and the power of sfumato, the subtle blurring of lines to create atmosphere and realism. "You use your brush as a weapon of mathematics, Signor Rinaldi," Isabella observed one afternoon, as Leo was meticulously applying a layer of pigment to model the curve of her throat. "No, Contessa," Leo replied, mixing a tiny dab of ultramarine into the shadow of the velvet to give it a cool, resonant depth. "Look at your hand." He was painting the hand derived from his clandestine garden sketches, the hand of the philosopher, not the pose of the noblewoman. The shadows under the knuckles are not black, they are blue, because the light of the atmosphere is cool. The highlights on the top are warm, the color of your lifeblood under your skin. She watched, fascinated. So to be truly seen, one must be dissected into geometry and light. "No," Leo corrected, placing a perfect, luminous touch of lead white on the tip of her index finger. To be truly seen, one must be painted with the understanding that the soul is revealed in the physics of the world. This intimate collaboration elevated the painting. Bellini would come over, his face pale, and simply nod. "The hand is alive, Leo. It is the hand of a mind that writes laws." While Leo's artistic bond with Isabella deepened, the rivalry with Giuliano grew poisonous. Giuliano had been relegated to mixing colors and preparing the gold leaf for the jewelry, essential but menial work. He saw the growing trust between the Contessa and Leo, and the increasing dependence of Bellini on his apprentice. One evening, after the Contessa had left and Bellini was out at a dinner with a patron, Leo was alone, working late on the Contessa's face. He had reached the most challenging part, the eyes. Bellini had insisted on a 3/4 profile, but Leo was painting her looking directly at the viewer, a bold, confrontational gaze that made the subject a participant in the viewer's world, not a passive object. Giuliano appeared in the doorway, holding a flagon of wine. "Tired, Rinaldi? You looked like death." "I am working, Giuliano," Leo said without looking up, his